Brian.
Welcome to our podcast, The Making and the Remaking of a Codependent Mind.
This week we are going to talk about the subject of caretaking.
And we've said that caretaking and people-pleasing are kind of two pillars of codependency.
Yeah, right. Kind of these kind of overarching themes of codependency, really.
And this episode is inspired by a listener question. I don't know if you want to read it.
Sure, yeah. This was recently and it was directed towards you. It says, where in Stephanie's life does she have codependent behaviors and what do they look like and feel like for her?
And like we just said, we have people-pleasing and caretaking as these two pillars. And we talked about during the people-pleasing episode that everyone wants to please people. It's a very human response.
And it's not necessarily an unhealthy response, being the fact that we're a social species and all that, like we've said a few times before.
Yeah,
there's healthy versions of all of these behaviors.
Even people who maintain that they don't care what people think of them.
Yeah, sure.
There's evidence that they do.
They do.
And certainly I do. I mean, I want people to like me, and it feels uncomfortable when they don't or when they're angry at me, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
But we hadn't talked about extensively caretaking, so we wanted to this time spend the episode on caretaking and kind of explore what maybe the healthy version of that looks like, and then maybe what the disordered version feels like and looks like.
Yeah, sure. How to contrast the two and how it can actually be difficult even when we're talking about the healthy version.
Exactly. And I think it's worthwhile to investigate why it is so difficult. Where do these impulses come from?
Yeah.
The impulse to care for each other being, I think, as deeply rooted as the impulse to want to please each other.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they are kind of tied together like that. Yeah.
So we included in kind of our definitions of codependency, and this is in many people's definitions of codependency, that it's one-sided caretaking. That's problematic.
Yeah, right. That's where it really starts to get problematic. It's not always problematic, but yes.
And the one place that it is not problematic, that is never problematic, is in the parent-child relationship.
Right. Yeah. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, so that being that fundamental caretaking relationship that involves all of these evolved psychological and emotional impulses and instincts that evolved over hundreds, thousands, if not millions of years of human evolution, those caretaking impulses.
And for our species, they're pretty necessary, given the fact that our human babies are so kind of just helpless.
Right. Right, exactly. So that impulse to care for our young is really deeply rooted, and as you're saying, makes sense that would be necessary for our species to survive.
Yeah. And
one interesting concept that I like in reading about kind of evolution and evolutionary psychology and the evolution of our psychology is this idea of the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. Mm-hmm. This refers to looking at the environment in which our bodies and minds evolved, and thinking about how that is different from our current environment and what potential challenges that might pose to our bodies and our minds and our emotional systems and our social systems.
Okay, yeah.
So this comes up a lot in nutritional science, in health sciences, because the food and nutritional environment in which our bodies evolved is very different from what it is now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is, so for instance, this is the premise behind a lot of these, like the paleo diet.
Yeah, sure.
So the paleo diet is suggesting that our bodies did not evolve to eat the food that we're currently eating, this highly processed food, lots of sugars, refined carbohydrates. Mm-hmm. And what it attempts to do is to encourage you to eat the way our Paleolithic ancestors eat. I mean, I don't know that much about the diet, but that seems to be the premise
it's kind
of
of like
that.
We ate this way for hundreds of thousands of years, and
if
here
not
we
millions
are,
of years.
so.
Yeah, so let's go back and eat that way. It's better and healthier for our body. And there seems to be some truth to that, in that, again, our bodies did evolve in very low calorie environments.
Yeah.
Such that those among us who had this kind of psychological and emotional instinct to seek out like high fat foods, for instance, when we came across them, would be more successful. Because obviously hunting down an antelope is a lot more difficult than eating a bunch of berries. So there had to be some psychological hunger motivation to drive us to hunt this antelope. And then when we managed to kill it, to just devour it, because this is a lot of calories. It's very beneficial.
Yeah, gorge on it, and then our bodies know how to kind of store it and use it.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
Yeah, but now it's just everywhere.
Of course, yeah. This is the problem now. It's like we could have an antelope every day, and many of us do, right? Yeah. Because we just go to McDonald's and get the caloric equivalent of an antelope just by putting down like $10 or something. So there's this disjunct between the environment in which our bodies evolve in terms of food, and then now we're trying to navigate our relationship with food currently. That's been kind of interrupted our evolved instincts and emotions towards food.
So how you're tying this to just the subject of caretaking?
I am. So because I'm thinking that, we also evolved in situations where babies and children were extremely cared for. Uh-huh. Often carried on their mother's back, surrounded by adult caregivers when we lived as we did for most of human history and evolution.
Yeah, a whole village.
In small tribes or villages. So they were just surrounded with care and attention. And so their own caretaking instincts were nurtured and encouraged by being cared for. Yeah. And the problem now, when children are not in that environment, where they're in environments in many ways that are the opposite of that. So I'm thinking about, again, environments of abuse or neglect or, what's called parentification. I don't know if we talked about that, but the idea of parents relying on their children for care, for the kind of care that they should be providing for their children. Mm-hmm. So either emotional care, it could be financial care or physical care. They expect their children to care for them.
Yeah, and so if it happens to a child, like a lot of other things, it leaves an imprint. And
it does. It I think, perverts these caregiving instincts that are there for a reason. And the reason is not to care for your parents. Those not why those impulses and instincts and skills evolved.
Right.
They evolved to care for your young, not to care for your parents, not to pacify people in power. So much like, our instinct to eat high-fat, high-calorie foods evolved in a situation because they were scarce. It benefited us at that point. But if you're now in your situation where they're plentiful, it's going to be problematic.
Yeah, right.
So people who grew up in a situation where they were care deprived, and even worse, they were expected to provide care for the more powerful people.
Yeah, where it wasn't natural, really. It didn't come from an impulse of, like, this is a normal situation where I feel compelled to care for someone. It's more like the person is forced to.
What I'm saying is we all feel compelled to care, but it shouldn't be expressed in a situation where you're a child and someone else is in a more powerful situation or position than you.
Right. And it could even be a peer or something like that. Like in my case with the friend we call G, where it's like this is a person my age, but this person's kind of coercing me into caretaking their emotional deficiencies.
Right. But we had your father as well.
Yeah, that's true, right?
He expected kind of emotional caretaking from you because he couldn't manage his own anger or frustration, which is all to say, very long-winded way to say, like, these are very ingrained and powerful emotions. So, it absolutely makes sense that people who had those emotions manipulated and abused from childhood would struggle even more with them in adulthood. But even as you said, even those of us who were cared for, it can be difficult often to know when and how to express our deep-seated impulse to care for each other.
Because we're talking about one-sided caretaking here and the different types of one-sided, but what would be a two-sided caretaking situation? Like, that's kind of...
Well, I hope that, for instance, you and I have a giving
relationship where both sides are kind of equally, at least there's an attempt, or it feels like to one or both of us that it's a mutually beneficial caretaking experience.
I think different people are born with different levels of caretaking instinct.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, right. I mean, it can also be nature or nurture. I mean, the whole experience.
Yeah. But, right. So it's hard to say. But I mean, I certainly sense that I'm a person that falls into caretaking pretty easily, is motivated to take care.
Because you have a long history of that.
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of the friendships that I ended up with, not all of them, became somewhat lopsided. And that's not a huge problem. And I don't think it's uncommon that, often in a friendship, a long-term friendship, even that maybe one person will be slightly more of the caretaking person,
Yeah, especially if you have something to offer and the other person actually sees you as someone they can rely on. It's
yeah, and I enjoy that. I mean, I do enjoy it. It's very satisfying. It's not just people who have codependent behavior. It can be satisfying to feel needed and that you are capable and that you are bringing something to someone else's life. But I will say a number of those friendships, when they became, I thought, kind of too lopsided. And then when I would maybe start to fall in to some feeling of resentment and a bit of exhaustion, that then I was being asked.
Yeah. How would you recognize that it would fall into this kind of...
Well, this is, what we talked about now for many episodes about knowing what your emotions are.
Yep.
I mean, I would start to feel what I recognized was resentment, that I was putting more into this and that I needed also care back, that person was not really able to give, and that they were bringing perhaps too much drama into my life. And
I think this is a good example of what when we talk about resentment isn't always this chronic problem. Like everyone can feel it.
Right.
So it's what you do with it. So what you did with it, you were able to recognize it, and you would do something about it.
Yeah, and I would decide, I need to kind of back away from this friendship. I mean, I can think of, a number of times that happened that felt to me, okay, well, this kind of ran its course. And, we've kind of fallen into these roles that I'm not really comfortable playing for the rest of my life. Sure. I mean, I play that for my children, absolutely. And then, even romantic relationships, unfortunately, I've had that happen. And I think it's particularly problematic in romantic relationships.
Sure, because it could have other effects. Like with a friendship, friendships can be very deep and very valuable and intimate, but there's other pieces to a romantic relationship that can get affected, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and Esther Perel, the psychotherapist that we've talked about before, has a great podcast and a number of books. Anyway, she talks about how that kind of, the caretaking dynamic in a relationship can really sap all the erotic energy out of romantic relationship, which of course makes sense because it should, because you don't, as a parent, you shouldn't have any kind of erotic or sexual emotions towards
like a parent-child relationship.
Can be, so, and that also is a breeding ground for resentment because it's not appropriate to have a lopsided caretaking, I don't think, long-term romantic relationship.
Yeah, I mean, unless the couple have both somehow agreed to that or something, but I can't imagine
why.
Yeah.
Everyone needs to receive care. I mean, that's just
right.
And everyone deserves to receive care from the people in their lives. So I don't know why you would agree to a situation in which. So again, but these are examples of this kind of too much of a good thing, right? Like so, eating too many high-calorie foods. So when there's in no world is caretaking a bad thing. It's fundamental to human society that we take care of each other. So it's critical that we all have these impulses and these emotions that drive us to care for each other.
You talk about how you had this history of kind of being a caretaker throughout your life. It was extremely valuable for me. But yes, we were very vulnerable into falling into that position of what you said. If it continued down that road and I didn't care for you, and you were the one that always started the relationship conversations, and I was just kind of, it could have very easily gone that same direction.
It could. And I was kind of particularly aware of not falling into that dynamic when we started, because I had just had a failure of a romantic relationship because of that, because it became this kind of lopsided caretaking, and I didn't want to do that again.
And you tried to reverse course on that, but it's really hard once it's ingrained.
Right? It can be really hard, yes. So, I mean, and we talked about this before, where there are many of the conversations that we would have about our relationship or about my feelings that would be triggering for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I did try to respect that trigger, but respect it by, pausing the conversation, maybe talking about where that triggered response was coming from, giving you a chance to recoup. But we always went back to those conversations for that reason, because
it's not like, that conversation's off limits, I better not. That's
I can't express my own anger or hurt or disappointment because that might trigger you. That's not a mutual caretaking relationship. That's the therapeutic relationship, or that's maybe a parent-child relationship.
Right.
And that's not the relationship I wanted to have with you.
Yeah. Or, similar to this, along those lines, you're not allowed to express anger or something, because even just you expressing disappointment or anger was triggering for me before I really knew it was. And so you could have also gone the path of, well, I better not raise my voice around him because obviously he has a hard time with that. Now you're muting your emotions, and that's just misdirected caretaking.
But again, I do have those impulses. And I remember once early on in our relationship, we went to a cuddle party. You were into cuddle parties for a period of your life, I think, in trying to recover from these abusive, toxic relationships in which you weren't touched with affection or care.
Right. Oh, should we explain briefly what that is?
Oh, right. What cuddle parties are you?
I mean, I'm sure it's nationwide, worldwide, probably. It's these get-togethers, be hosted by someone, and everyone goes, and it's kind of, at a certain time they close the doors, and then they tell people about these rules of how to engage and do some exercises to get people used to saying no and yes, and then consent for physical touch. And then there's usually like an hour long just free cuddle session where people are walking around going, can I cuddle with you? Or can I stroke your shoulder? Or some things like that. Where, so that's what it is.
So I went with you. And one thing I said afterwards is, I don't think I can be in that room, because there were a lot of people in the room who were clearly struggling with their relationships and with loneliness and with needing care.
Yeah.
And I, again, had getting out of a long-term romantic relationship where that became too much of a dynamic. I was like, this is activating all my caretaking impulses.
Now I'm in a room full of people that
who
all
need care, and I just want to give them all hugs. And that's not really what it's supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about you getting the touch that you want and need, and not about just giving touch to anybody who needs it.
Right.
So, it's certainly something my whole life that I've thought about and needed to be aware of. And it has affected some of my relationships in not a positive way. Yeah. So this is, again, too much caretaking or too one-sided caretaking does not have the result often that you want it to have, which is a mutually fulfilling, intimate relationship. It often has the opposite effect, much like eating a lot of highly processed, highly calorie foods does not have the effect of a healthy, nourished body. We did not evolve the caretaking instinct for one-sided caretaking. It evolved to knit together a family and a social system and a human community.
Right.
It did not evolve so that you can caretake people in order to tie them to you or to neutralize their abuse or neglect.
Yeah, sure. To keep yourself safe, really, in whatever way you think that is doing it. So, it's almost like what you're talking about here, these times where caretaking went a little too far for you. It's almost like you could place that on a codependency spectrum a little bit. Just because all of this is like a spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's one of the messages here is these are all very human, very understandable behaviors.
Yeah, right.
That got kind of co-opted and perverted by situations of neglect or abuse or trauma.
And then they just went way too far. So in what you're talking about, where it goes too far, it's not like you started right in with it going too far. You didn't go, it's some abusive person didn't come along and demand caretaking from you and you just did it. It was, you started off slowly caretaking someone that deserved it.
Yeah, offering care, but eventually not enough care came back. And this dynamic became that I was the one that would be in charge and capable and make
Yeah.
sure things happen and take care of, and that I didn't need that level of care back, which is not true. I do need it.
Right. That was a perception I've heard you say before, where it was like kind of that was the person that you were caring for. If they didn't say it explicitly, they acted as if you didn't need any care. Kind of.
Yeah, well, and that happened kind of too in some of these friendships as well.
Yeah.
And not that they were, the other person necessarily even has to be an abusive person, but maybe just slightly disordered and needing a level of care that I don't need, which is not to say I don't need care. I do.
Yeah, right.
And often another person will need a higher level of care for a period. But that period can't be for the whole relationship.
No, right.
And you talked about earlier how we wanted kind of equal caretaking, but it doesn't necessarily have to be equal.
Just on average.
Yeah, it kind of has to average out, but also has to feel fair.
Yeah, sure.
So like,
yeah,
maybe because of your past struggles and because I, again, was fortunate not to experience many of the difficulties that you've experienced, maybe I need less of a level of emotional and psychological care.
Yeah, since you don't have triggers,
Right.
you're already one step ahead on that.
But again, that doesn't mean I need no care.
Right.
And as long as I'm getting the care I need from this relationship, it doesn't have to be equal. Like I'm fine that sometimes you get more as long as I'm getting what I need.
Yeah.
And there's there's dozens of ways to care for someone, right? There's, in terms of you can care for people domestically, you can care for people physically, you can care for them emotionally, psychologically, financially. And when you add all that in, I mean, we do, I think, have a pretty equal balanced
and it's something
relationship
that we can and should evaluate on an ongoing basis too. So it's not like we have one conversation and then let it go for 12 months or something. It's good to just regularly check in about how those things are going, how our communication is.
And it's interesting too, because like we're saying, your caretaking instincts were really perverted and exploited. Such that when you came to our relationship, even though you are a caring person, you would actually kind of struggle to care for me.
Yeah, right. Because you weren't demanding it. I was used to it being demanded. And so if you weren't asking for help or something, not like it was asking for help is a wrong way to put it, but we've gone into those relationships pretty much in depth. It was demanded in various ways. And so I was used to behaving and reacting kind of.
So they felt, your previous abusive partners, they felt entitled to your care.
Yeah.
And so moments of caretaking or acts of caretaking were really tests where you would have to get it right or you would be in trouble.
Yeah.
So even kind of when I would ask for care, that almost became a trigger for you.
It's true. Yeah.
Because you couldn't just tap into your natural feelings of affection for me and desire to care for me. Right. Because all of a sudden you're in this situation where you're being tested. And
I would get kind of washed over, with some kind of trauma trigger associated with it. Just felt similar. But then also I would get washed over with new feelings that came from just within the context of our relationship, which is shame. Shame from those prior relationships that I wasn't really aware of during those relationships. Now I learned all these things about it and stuff, and how much shame I felt for the caretaking that I did do for those people, and how it can look the same. Like my behaviors that I do to caretake you may look and sound the same as they did when I was doing codependent caretaking of an abusive person. And so that's hard to stomach.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that we talked about with people pleasing is that if you're people pleasing in order to keep yourself safe, in order to make sure everybody likes you, you're going to end up people pleasing the wrong people.
Yes, right.
Because the healthier people in your life aren't expecting that from you, aren't going to demand that from you, and may not even want it from you.
Yeah.
So you're going to be focusing all your attention on these disordered people. That's very similar to what can happen with caretaking.
Right, exactly.
Because one thing that when we first started going out as well, you started engaging in many kind of reflexive caretaking behavior.
Right.
In terms of financially or taking responsibility for domestic chores or whatever, just things that you were expected to do in past relationships. So that became kind of this caretaking script that you thought I would expect or feel entitled to.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, I don't expect someone to financially take care of me. If we want to form a financial partnership, and if that works for you and it addresses your needs as well, that's great. But I don't want it just to demand that I be financially taken care of, and that you are just willing to do it because that's a caretaking habit that you had. So whereas, again, if you offer that to a disordered person, as you did, they were like, yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'll take that. I'll take all the caretaking you can give me, and without questioning where it's coming from. So again, you're very less likely to end up in a lopsided caretaking relationship with a healthier person. It is probably more with distorted people that are going to absorb that care and not respond
and
with
you're just
care.
fueling the fire too. Like once you go down that road, basically this person goes, wow, I feel cared for. They may not be conscious of the fact that it's lopsided.
Yeah, we've talked about how Jay, your most recent narcissistic abusive ex, felt that no one loved her the way that you loved her.
Right.
She felt obviously very cared for and very safe. And that was all based on fear.
Yeah, it was all based on fear and codependency.
And not love. Whereas what I want and what I hope for both of us is that we have caretaking that's based on love and affection and intimacy.
There's a story that popped into my mind. I don't know if we'll leave this in or not, but that time we were at the cabin a couple of years ago, and I was going to go to the bathroom, but you asked if I could make you some tea.
Yes.
And this is what popped into my head, just because as a good example of, so what happened is I was on my way to the bathroom and you're like, oh, can I have some tea? And I was like, oh, well, I was going to go to the bathroom, but okay, I guess I can get you tea first.
Right. Like, I mean, and this look of kind of annoyance and and slight amount of panic too. Right.
Yeah.
Just kind of.
Like, why are you demanding this of me? I need to go to the bathroom.
And I was like, no, you can go to the bathroom. You just got up. So I didn't know. I thought you were going to the kitchen. Yeah. You can feel free to go to the bathroom first.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, that I don't know how that ties in, but I feel like it does somehow. Like it's just kind of this misdirected caretaking. Like, oh, well, because that's what you take care of this tea request.
Yeah, but that would happen, right? In your previous relationships. Yeah. If you were asked of something, you were expected to deliver.
Yeah.
It didn't matter what you needed or wanted at that moment. But you bring me tea every morning now. Yeah. And I feel like it's an act of care.
It is. Yeah. Right.
Not an act of obligation or fear that I'll get mad if you don't.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just how that went down, basically, which is what made it so obviously, and it bothered you. And we had a couple of conversations at least after it to try to get to the bottom of what it was, because it was not that far into this whole process, really.
And on the other side of it, I mean, me not wanting to receive caretaking that's rooted in fear or obligation is part of like, I don't want to be resented.
Yeah. Right.
Because I saw you express a lot of resentment on those past relationships. And it's like, well, I don't want that. I mean, I only want you to be doing things that are motivated by your own feelings.
Yeah.
Not feelings of love, fear or shame, but feelings of love and affection and mutual caretaking. And, you'll hear people who say, oh gosh, I'm always the one that does X, Y, and Z in this friendship or this relationship? Why do I always end up in friendships and relationships where I'm always the one? And that's a good question. I think they often ask it rhetorically in a kind of self-pity mode. And I have to say, like, sometimes I've done that too. It's like, why am I always the one that has to?
Why do I always call?
But it's a very good question because there actually is an answer. Because you shouldn't be ending up in relationships in which you are doing all the caretaking. It's
fine to ask that question.
It's important to ask that question. And it's important to take the answer seriously. Yeah. And the answer probably has to do with the way that you show up in relationships and the kind of people that are drawn to someone who will caretake them. I mean, if you're ending up with people that you find yourself in the caretaker role, that means there are people out there, and there are, who want to be taken care of. And they're not great partners long term. Yeah,
and there could be a variety of different types of people that are looking for that kind of care, from abusive people all the way down to just kind of just disordered in some way.
Yeah.
But also self-centered. Pretty much anyone that doesn't have enough sense to reciprocate care is self-centered in some way.
Right. But it may be because they're in crisis. as well. And
Sure.
many people spend most of their life in crisis.
Yeah.
It's very unfortunate. But the extent that we can rescue each other is very limited.
Mm-hmm.
So constantly seeking out people to caretake and then giving yourself over is probably not going to end up being a very fulfilling path. Although, again, it feels good. It does feel good to take care of people.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people that do need it. Sure.
Well, we all need it, is what we're saying.
Well,
we all need it, right? And you know, there's this, literally the saying, it's better to give than receive. There's a reason why that's saying, because it feels good to give of yourself.
Yes.
But it's, again, long-term in interpersonal relationships, if it's only one-sided, it just, I don't think it's going to have the effect that anybody wants. It has made me, so I described feelings of frustration, feelings of lack of intimacy when the caretaking started to feel too lopsided to me. It also feels lonely.
Sure.
You feel alone in a relationship in which the caretaking is mostly going one way.
Mm-hmm. Like
because
you're not seen.
You're not seen.
Yeah.
And you're not cared for, I guess, which is very similar, right? Yeah. This idea of balance, which has come up often in this podcast, is really important in caretaking, in people pleasing, in all of these responses, which I imagine can make it difficult to, as we say, kind of heal codependency or break the codependent habit, because it's not like alcoholics, well, I'm just going to stop drinking alcohol. You have to, for your own emotional and physical well-being, continue to engage in interpersonal relationships and have to find a way to moderate.
That's kind of like most of the behaviors that we're talking about here, most of the codependent behaviors. And that's why I think it's good that we focus on the healthy versions of it, because that's what needs to be done, is it's shifting the motivation for these behaviors and then hopefully healing from there. So like, okay, this is coming from empathy and love as opposed to fear. You know, so if you're fixing kind of the source of these behaviors.
And also, I want to bring it back, the nutritional analogy back, right? You don't want to put yourself in a situation where it's really easy to overeat in an unhealthy way, right? I mean, so if you're kind of struggling to eat healthier foods and to eat healthier amounts, like don't go to a buffet, an all-you-can-eat buffet, right? You're just asking for trouble. And this is similarly, like, don't get involved with people who clearly need a lot of care.
Yeah, sure.
Don't put yourself in that situation. It's going to be much harder to moderate those impulses. And that's essentially what I was saying about the cuddle party. Like, I can't be in a cuddle party right now because I'm trying to get a handle on the level of care I give to people in my life.
Yeah. This is all condensed into one room.
Yeah, right.
Like
so
20 people. And
you need to be careful about the situation and relationships and the people that you are connected to. If you are, again, trying to moderate some of these very natural, very human impulses to please the people around you and to care, well, make sure that those people around you then don't demand or expect an unhealthy, one-sided level of people-pleasing and caretaking. Make sure that you're getting back from the people in your life care and attention and pleasure.
Sounds like a good
plan.
Approach.
So thanks to the listener that sent this question. It really was thought-provoking and generated some good discussions. Again, we really appreciate people who comment, but also review and follow and like the podcast. That helps other people find our podcast.
And we'll be back again in a couple weeks with another topic. We hope you join us.